Okay. So I will put, this is the offer information that I had sent over yesterday via email, but I will also put it in the chat so you guys have it readily available. Okay. But here is our subject property. I'm just going to go right into MLS. Can you guys see my MLS too? Cool.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So this is a single family home in Glendale. It went on the market last Thursday or Friday, and they actually accepted an offer last night, but that's okay. We can still pretend. It's a 3-bed, 2.5 bath in Glendale. Exciting thing about this is that there's water frontage. So something to keep in mind when you have buyers, if you do have water frontage, it might be on a floodplain. It actually will say that here too in MLS if the listing agent has done their due diligence and included it. But just something to take note of, if you do have buyers that are interested in a property on a floodplain, it might require additional homeowners insurance. So if you ever have questions about that, you can always ask the listing agent to find out a little bit more information from them as to what the seller has been required to get insured. But I digress. So we've got a house here that is on city water, city sewer, which is over here. And the municipality, so Glendale is a city. So that'll be important for our offer. I'm not going to necessarily read the public remarks here, because it's a lot of just marketing information. But what I usually like to do right out of the gate is see what's going on in the private remarks. So they've given us a little bit of background information on how to access the house, the listing agent's contact information, and Peter is asking that if you do submit an offer, you call or text him in advance. So this is something that also I think is helpful. Not every listing agent's going to do it, but in the private remarks, they're giving you a little bit more information as it pertains to offer presentation timeframes or binding acceptance timeframes. So as I mentioned earlier, the house went on the market either like last Thursday or last Friday. And the initial goal for the sellers was to review offers on Monday, the 4th. So any offers that were presented between Friday and Sunday, everything would be presented on the 4th. And then offers received the 4th and after allow for 24 hours binding acceptance. So I did call the listing agent to ask a little bit of information. And one of my questions that I did ask, and I'll just get into the offer practice document. I'm going to skip the buyer profile. There were a few offers that had been submitted at the time that I called yesterday. So I think he had said he had 2 offers at the time. He had heard a third might be coming. I asked if the seller was offering cooperative compensation to a buyer's agent, and he said yes, that they were. And that it was their preference. If you could sign a compensation agreement before submitting your offer, that would be great. Otherwise, you could put it in the offer. But for our practices today, we're going to pretend that we signed the compensation agreement. And then as the private remarks indicated, any offer submitted on November 4th or after would require 24 hours binding acceptance. So those are just some of the types of information that you can ask listing agents if your buyers are thinking about putting in an offer, just doing your due diligence, picking up the phone and finding out if there's anything from a seller preference perspective that you and your buyer should be aware of just to help make your buyer's offer a little bit more attractive. So let's talk about our buyer. Today's buyer, we're gonna help Bobby Portis. Has anyone heard what's been happening to Bobby in the news?
He was robbed.
Totally robbed while he was at a game. Annoying. So Bobby signed a buyer agency with us on October 1st. He agreed that our compensation for his buyer agency would be 2.4%, and that document was valid for 90 days. So that makes Bobby a client. of the firm, not a customer. So right out of the gate, when we get into the offer, we'll see why that is important, an important distinction. He's got a closing frame or closing time frame that's flexible. He can move whenever. Would like a home inspection and a radon inspection. Let's pretend that for our purposes, Bobby is pre-approved for up to $550,000. He's got 12% ready to make a down payment on. And right now, his lender said our rates are at maybe a little bit below 7%, but for our offer, we can use 7%. Something else about Bobby. So we have been working with him just for a month or so, but he's lost out on some other offers. And he is now, because of some practice and unfortunate losses, he is comfortable including an escalation clause with this offer if he feels and if we feel that it's necessary. So that's something that we'll take a look at when we get into we'll get into the offer. So specifically for practice today, everyone can kind of use the same instructions. We're going to offer asking price, which is $484,900. Bobby's going to have all the inclusions and exclusions that have been identified in MLS. That's what we'll put in our offer. The closing date, I selected December 16th. And one thing I guess I didn't indicate too, after I talked to the listing agent, to Peter, the sellers actually did have a preference, like they wanted to be out probably before the holidays, but if needed, they wanted post-closing occupancy. So I didn't want to add that to our offer practice today because I wanted to focus our time and attention on leveraging that escalation clause. But just so you guys are aware as to what was really happening, the seller was somewhat interested in post-closing occupancy if the timing of closing needed to be a little bit later. For earnest money for our offer, we're going to put down 2% of the purchase price. So, rule of thumb for earnest money, every agent's perspective is a little bit different, but on average, we see in our market between 1% and 3% being offered as earnest money. So for today's practice, we'll just use 2%.
A question there.
Yeah.
Just for simplicity, can we just, I would imagine the buyer wouldn't have a problem. Could we just bump it up to $10,000 to make it a?
Totally.
All right.
Totally. Yep. And even too, like, it all also depends on how much money your buyer has on hand at that moment, because this is one of those items in your buyer consultation where you're going to want to find out a little bit about your buyer's financial situation. Now, some buyers don't want to reveal all information about what's happening with them financially, and that's totally okay, right? They're going to have to disclose that or have to have that level of detail in a conversation with their lender. But it's important for buyers to understand, what am I going to need money for immediately, and what am I going to need money for at the closing table? And in that buyer consultation, what I like to do is make sure that buyers know, okay, here's examples of items that we will need you to pay for and you to fund as soon as we get an offer accepted. One is earnest money. Another is a home inspection that can cost between, $400 to $500. We might have to have follow-up inspections that would require maybe a $200 deposit. I don't know. So earnest money is something too that a lot of buyers might not be aware that they will need to be able to have on hand within, say 5 days after getting their offer accepted. A seller or the listing firm that's going to be holding the money, they're going to take that money and deposit it right away. So
in this instance, Bobby had it.
Bobby had it. So if to Arnie's question, like, could you put $10,000? Sure. You can really put whatever amount you and your buyers feel most comfortable with. The buyers need to also understand, and we won't go into it at depth or in depth when we get to the offer document. A lot of people just assume too that if a transaction doesn't get to closing, that their earnest money is automatically returned, and that's not necessarily the case. So that's also something to keep in mind as you guys are strategizing your offer with your buyers, because there might be a situation where, you know, the seller doesn't return all the earnest money, or maybe doesn't return, or maybe only returns a portion. Other things that we're going to do in this offer in terms of contingencies will include a home inspection and a radon inspection. We'll include financing based on what I had outlined earlier. We will have an appraisal contingency. And then just for this offer, we'll include the escalation clause. Bobby has said, you know what, I'm willing to go up to 510. You, buyer's agent, can figure out what increments we should be raising our offer. But I don't want to pay more than 510. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, our seller is offering to pay 2.4% commission to a buyer's agent. And let's assume that we've already filled out the compensation agreement ahead of time, signed it, and sent it back to Peter, the listing agent. Therefore, we don't need to include it in our offer. Okay. So I've already started to go into zip forms and fill out our offer. Can you guys still see my computer?
Yep.
Yep.
Good, okay. So we're dating our offer today, so we're drafting it today. I've crossed off the agent of seller and listing firm and agent of buyer and seller, because we are in fact Bobby's agent. We are his buyer's agent. He signed a buyer agency agreement with us, which makes us the agent of the buyer. I've put his name here on line 3, the address of the property, 1150 West Riverview Drive. It's in the city of Glendale. So this is the municipality type. It might be a village, a city, a town. And again, if you don't know, that's should be specified here within MLS. And here is it is right here, municipality, city. And it's in the county of Milwaukee. Our purchase price, I mentioned in the offer instructions, we're just going to offer asking out of the gate. So 484.9. All you have to do when you fill in zip forms is just plug in this number and it will automatically just spew out the words. So you don't have to figure out how to go back to like middle school when you were learning about, maybe people didn't learn about checking accounts. I did. The inclusions I've taken right from MLS. So the fridge, the range, dishwasher, disposal, washer, dryer, microwave. Again, something that you are going to want to make sure that your buyer is aware of. Like, these are all the things that the seller is including. Are these okay for you? Maybe your buyer says, you know what, we don't need the microwave. It's totally up to you and your buyers. If you would want to, in that instance, move the microwave from an inclusion to an exclusion. But for now, we're just going to make things easy and keep it the way it was in MLS. Not included in our purchase price is the seller's personal property. And then this section here is just a reminder as to things that are considered fixtures within a property. So if there's ever, you know, an item that might be kind of in a gray area, sometimes it's like bathroom mirrors that maybe are just hung up with like a nail, or it might be, you know, a light fixture. Technically, those things like a light fixture specifically is considered a fixture, but there are some instances where sellers are like, you know what, that's an antique, it's my grandma's and I don't want to part with it, or I don't want to give it up. So if there's ever anything that you're not quite sure as to what might be included or might not, just pick up the phone and ask the listing agent just to confirm. In terms of binding acceptance, so the listing agent said that they would need 24 hours to review. So I've given until, I'm just assuming I'm going to send this over today for review, I'll give them until tomorrow. Anytime that you've got a date in the offer, it goes through 11:59 p.m. on that date. So right now, this would mean they can get back to us with binding acceptance up until 11:59 p.m. tomorrow. Otherwise, after that, it's technically like expired or not valid. If you ever wanted to just add a specific time on a day, so maybe like we don't want to give them until 11:59 tomorrow, and maybe we just want to do 8 p.m. on the 6th, you can do that too. But just know that anytime you have a date, it's technically up until 11:59 p.m. on that date. The transaction is to be closed on, and here's where I put in December 16th. So always make sure too that you're not scheduling closing for a Saturday or Sunday. And that's at a place selected by the buyer. And I just realized I didn't strike out this at the place selected by the seller. So zip forms for all of you should already have put into line 48 for you, this language here at the place selected by the buyer. But it's nice just to cross off this, otherwise it's a little bit confusing. Something to make sure, when we get into the subsequent pages, zip forms will not automatically add the address on pages 2 through 11. So all you would have to do is just make sure you go in, add it once to page 2, and then it'll do it automatically for pages 3 through 11, but just make sure you always have the full address at the top of every page. So here is where we're talking about earnest money. And, in all honesty, I probably would have rounded this up to like $9,700, but for the purposes of practice today, I said 2%, and 2% of the purchase price is $9,698. So we're being very specific. And the amount of days that your buyer has to turn that money in is what you would put here on line 59. If you don't put anything in, 5 days is the automatic default. In terms of a strategy here, sometimes depositing that earnest money within one day is very attractive to a seller, right? It shows that your buyers are ready to go. For practice today, I put in 5 days. My personal opinion, like usually I try to get my buyers to get that in within 2 to 3 days, but also remember too that you've got potentially weekends in play here. So just make sure that you're always kind of looking forward a few days to make sure that, things can be turned in accordingly. And then all earnest money shall be delivered to and held by, in our case, it's going to be the listing firm. Keller Williams, as the listing brokerage, will be the one that will hold the earnest money. If there is another firm holding the earnest money, it usually would be specified by the listing agent in private remarks on MLS, or they might tell you verbally in conversations that you have prior to submitting your offer, or sometimes agents also put it as a document within MLS. Just some offer instructions. If you don't know, always just ask. But, typically it's held by the listing firm. And something too to just take note about earnest money. Earnest money can be sent through the mail. It can be commercially delivered. It can be electronically delivered or personally delivered. The preference really is electronically delivered, and that would be through trust funds, which is an electronic form of payment that your buyers can use. It's through MLS. I won't show you how to do that today, but that's usually the safest and easiest for people. There is an $8 charge for buyers to leverage trust funds. But if they don't want to use trust funds, I would say then the number 2 best way to deliver earnest money is actually to physically drop it off in person. Sometimes mail can be slow. Sometimes it can be intercepted in the mail and taken. So just a couple of things to think about as you are talking about this section with your buyers. I mentioned earlier, it's not necessarily a given that a buyer's earnest money would be returned to them if the deal falls through and doesn't get to closing. So just make sure that you familiarize yourself with this language in this section about how earnest money could be dispersed and what happens if isn't an agreement as to how money will be dispersed. Like a party could take the other party to small claims court. So just something to keep in mind and also familiarize yourself with and make sure that you explain to your clients accordingly. The real estate condition report. So Wisconsin requires that all sellers fill out a condition report if perhaps they've never lived on the property, if they are a personal representative of the seller, or maybe it was, given to deeded down or willed over to, family members and they didn't live there, that might be an instance where they don't fill out the condition report, but otherwise a seller is required to do so. And here in the offer, we just have to indicate that the seller has provided a condition report and that the condition report for us was dated on October 23rd, 2024. So I got that information from MLS. I went into the document section. Here's our condition report. It was filled out on October 23rd. And then it was also signed on October 23rd. So it's important that you put that date in here on line 107. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your buyer agrees with what's on the condition report. It's just indicating that they have in fact received a condition report and they're acknowledging that. Page 3 is a pretty easy page. Usually nothing is ever crossed off. It's just a list of defects or things that might come up and that a seller should disclose if they are in fact aware of something of that nature on their property. But here on the top of page 4, we're going to get to the home inspection. So we know that Bobby does in fact want to have a home inspection. So our offer is contingent on having that home inspection. So we're going to check the box in line 193. If you aren't including a contingency that has a box in front of it, it's best practice to put NA in that box versus just leaving it blank. But for Bobby, he wants the home inspection. We are going to include it and therefore checking that box. So as part of the home inspection, that is just a visual inspection that a licensed professional is doing of the property. As a result of that home inspection, the inspector might in fact recommend some follow-up inspections by maybe a roofer or a basement company, or if there's an in-ground pool, maybe a pool person. But your buyer is automatically covered and allowed to have those follow-up inspections based on that language here in lines 200 to 202. So the buyer can have follow-up inspections based on whatever the home inspector recommends. Your buyer can choose to have them, your buyer can choose not to have them. But this just gives us the opportunity to, in fact, have those additional people come into the home. So the seller has to give us permission to do so. Now, in line 206, this talks about how, when the contingency will be considered satisfied. So all dates and deadlines in this document in the offer to purchase go into effect starting on the day of acceptance. So this item here, line 10 or date 10 days, this means say we get our offer accepted tomorrow, November 6th. So November 7th would be day number 1, day number 2, day number 3, etc. This date here, these number of days, isn't just the number of days that you have to get the home inspection completed. This includes, you have to have the home inspection done. If you're going to have any follow-up inspections done, it has to be done within this time frame. And if you're trying to do any negotiations with the seller in terms of repairs or price reductions or credits to help resolve or to cure the home inspection, this all has to get done within these number of days. If you don't put a date or a number in here, it automatically goes to 15 days. But just something to keep in mind, like our closing date is December 16th. So we've got like a month and change. So I think 10 days is fair. If you had a fast close, like a 30-day close, you might not be putting, say, 15 days for the home inspection. You might be putting like 7 days or 10 days because your time frame is already shortened. Usually this home inspection period is the first contingency to be satisfied, and it's usually the most, I wouldn't say stressful, but like the busiest. So usually if you have a shorter closing time frame, you don't want to have like if you close in 30 days, you're not going to want to have a 15-day home inspection because that's like half of the time between finding acceptance and closing. So that's not so great. So for our purpose today, I'm just going to say we're going to get all this figured out in 10 days. Okay. Now we're going to give our seller the right to cure. In our market right now, it's still very much a seller's market. And I would say 99, don't quote me on that. It's not a scientific study. But I would say the overwhelming majority, like 99% of offers, give the seller the right to cure. So how does the seller have the right to cure? You could be negotiating, again, repairs. Let's say that we have to have a roof fixed. Um, within those 10 days that we have our home inspection set for, we're negotiating, maybe the seller is willing to have the roof repaired at their expense, to be completed within like 7 days of closing. Or another way a seller could cure is to, or both parties could work on some type of price reduction or closing cost credit. But say you don't come to an agreement, and any type of agreement would be solidified in the form of an amendment where both parties have to sign. Um, Say you don't come to a resolution and your buyers are like, well, you know, um, all of these things need to be repaired and we just can't fix them ourselves. If the seller's not going to do it, then, and we can't afford to do it, we're going to issue a notice of defect. So that is where the buyer would be listing everything that's wrong on the house and submitting it to the seller to cure. And this is where we just start reading some of the language right here in the offer. So if the seller has the right to cure, the seller can satisfy the contingency by sending a notice back to the buyer within blank days after the buyer delivers a notice of defect saying they're going to cure. So in this example, the buyer hands the seller a notice saying, here's all the defects we're asking you to cure. We're giving the seller 2 days to respond as to whether or not they're going to cure or not. I usually don't leave this as 10 days. I like to shorten it. If you're having communications with the other party throughout this time frame, there shouldn't really be any surprises. And the seller should not have to, in my opinion, we shouldn't have to give the seller that amount of time to figure out whether or not they're going to cure the notice of defects or not.
Hey Kim, I have a question. This is Justin.
Yeah,
So 2 days, and that's not 2 business days. That's 2 days to like,
correct.
got it.
Yep, yep. The seller can also satisfy the contingency by curing the defects in a good and workmanlike manner. And you're going to see at the end of this offer, I added some additional language in the blank lines that kind of talk about this, like how we would give the seller the right to cure. So you'll see this in a moment. But then they also have they can also satisfy the contingency by delivering to, the buyer a report indicating all the work that has been done, and they have to do that within 3 days. Now, the offer is null and void. The offer is dead if the buyer makes sends over a notice and also sends the home inspection report. I'm going to talk about that too in a second. The offer is dead if they send over a notice and the inspection report, and the seller never had the right to cure to begin with. Right? So the buyer maybe has the home inspection done. The buyer did not give the seller the right to cure. After the home inspection, maybe there's so many things that came up, the buyer's like, I'm out. Buyer can get out simply by delivering a notice of defects and a copy of the home inspection report if the buyer did not give the seller the right to cure. The deal is also null and void if the seller has the right to cure, but determines they're not going to. They're not going to cure everything. Or the seller has the right to cure and they didn't send back the notice indicating they were cure in time. So this is kind of I get tongue tied like reading this out loud, but this is a section that you guys should be reviewing just to make sure that you understand, because every answer to any question that somebody has is already in the offer itself. You just have to familiarize yourself with it. So one thing that I forgot to mention, when you do get a home inspection, it's okay and you should be sending a copy of the home inspection report over to the listing agent. So that is a document that is very okay to send to the listing agent. Do not send the home inspection report to your lender. That is a no-no. Okay. Moving on down into radon. So Bobby also indicated, Bobby the buyer wants to have a radon test as well. And typically radon falls along the same time frame as a home inspection contingency. So we've checked the box, meaning the offer is contingent on having the radon tested. And the offer is contingent again upon the buyer getting a written report of the radon test. Many of home inspectors now can also conduct a radon test for your buyers at the same time as the home inspection. So how this works, the home inspector or whomever is going to do the radon test will leave a radon kit, a detection kit in the basement of the property, and it has to sit there for 48 hours because it collects data throughout that time frame. The home inspector will then go back, or whomever is doing the radon test will go back to the house, pick up the test, and then we'll be able to provide you, the buyer, and the buyer's agent with information as to the results of that test.
I have a quick,
Typically, go ahead.
sorry, just to what you're getting to, why would you ever have someone do a radon test or encourage it if they're willing to cure? Why would you want to take that time frame when there's really nothing to gain? If they get the house, they could get the radon test themselves.
They totally could.
Okay.
This is one of those contingencies where you're going to have to understand how your buyers are going to feel about including this or not. To cure a radon test, to fix any high levels of radon, you would put in a radon abatement system, and that can be between like $1,200 and $1,500. A lot of buyers are okay taking this on themselves after closing, but there are some that are like, no, I want to have it included within my offer. Typically the buyer pays for the test. So here we've said it's going to be at the buyer's. We struck out seller's expense. And we followed the same time frame. We're going to figure this out within 10 days. It's the same time frame as your home inspection. We gave the seller the right to cure, and the right to cure follows the same type of language and steps to cure as the home inspection. So make sure you read that. But this is one of those items that maybe a buyer is comfortable having the radon test done after closing, and they're okay taking on mediating that at any point. But for our practice today, I just wanted to make sure that we had it in there. Okay, moving on to the financing section. So we know Bobby's getting a loan. He's been pre-approved for up to $550,000. He's getting a 30-year loan, and he is pre-approved with a local lender. So because he's getting a loan, we've checked the box here in line 248. So the offer is contingent upon the buyer getting a written, and I've typed in here, line 249, the type of loan that he's going for. If this was a 15-year loan, you'd put it 15-year conventional. If this was a VA loan, you'd put VA loan in line 249. If it was FHA, you put FHA. So the loan type is what goes here in line 249. And then we're going to get that loan commitment as described below within blank days after acceptance of this offer. I've put 28 days. We're closing in like 40 some days, you know, I would probably, to make this competitive, I mean, I might even put like 14 days. But this is a time frame where I would strongly encourage you to ask your buyer's lender, how quickly do they think they could help provide the loan commitment? Um, Lenders can now get things done within 14 or 21 days. Um, but you never want to put a date here or a number of days here that might seem a little bit aggressive if you haven't gotten the lender to communicate that they could in fact meet that timeline. So for our practice today, I just put 28 days. The financing is going to be an amount of not less than blank. The amount that you have here, so this is where I don't have my phone on me. This is where I open up my phone and I pull up my mortgage calculator. I use Carl's mortgage calculator, Carl with a K. That's the app that I use. The amount that you put here in line 251 is the purchase price minus the down payment. So this is the amount of money that Bobby is going to be getting a loan for. So this is $484,900 minus his 12% down payment. Make sense? I'll assume yes. It's going to be for a term of not less than 30 years. This is a 30-year loan and it's going to be amortized. So his payments and the interest are going to be amortized over 30 years. Usually these two numbers match. Initial monthly payments of principal and interest shall not exceed blank. So this amount here represents a 12% down payment and an interest rate of 7% on the purchase price of $484,900. So this is just what his mortgage is going to be every month, his principal plus interest. What you need to make sure you communicate to your buyers is that this isn't going to be necessarily the amount that they're going to pay every month, because the buyer has to acknowledge that the lender may require additional monthly payments of 1/12 of the estimated taxes, hazard insurance, PMI, etc. So typically when you're paying your mortgage, you're paying not only your principal plus interest, but your lender might also include 1/12 of your taxes that you owe and then 1/12 of their home insurance. Excuse me. So that's, you know, kind of the full monthly payment. This is just what would Bobby owe on his principal plus interest based on the terms that we've indicated above. Any questions? Did everybody get this if you plugged it into a calculator? Double check my math. Okay, cool. Down below, this is a fixed rate mortgage, so meaning it's going to be the same interest rate every single year. It stays fixed, and I put 7% here. If you don't know what's going on with interest rates, by all means, pick up the phone and call the buyer's lender. Some agents put a little bit of a cushion on the number, so maybe interest rates right now are, I don't know, where are they? 6.5? I don't know. Let's say interest rates are 6.5. I'd probably still put 7% here as a little bit of a cushion for my offer. So this just indicates how you satisfied the financing commitment, and that's by providing a loan commitment letter to the sellers. Make sure you familiarize yourself with that section. This isn't based on seller financing, so I believe this is our first box where we're talking, this isn't included in our offer, so I've just put NA. If this was a cash offer, this is where we would indicate such, and we would say how many days we would have to provide a proof of funds to the seller showing that we actually have cash on hand to purchase. But for our offer today, Bobby's getting financing, so we don't have to fill that section out. The appraisal contingency. So I have checked the box that yes, the offer's contingent upon the buyer's lender having the property appraised. Now, that's not what really this contingency though is all about. If your buyer is getting financing, there's a very strong likelihood that the lender is going to have the property appraised, right? What this contingency does is bring more specificity around how would we cure the appraisal if the appraised value comes in lower than what we're offering. So say we're offering 484.9 and the appraiser comes in and says the house is only worth 475. So we're $15,000 off. There's a very good chance that your buyer's lender is not going to give the buyer the loan because the buyer's underwriting department believes the house isn't worth that amount of money. So how do we resolve this? In a more balanced market, usually there's a lot of back and forth negotiation between the sellers and the buyers. Typically, when you give the seller the right to cure the appraisal contingency, which we're doing here, that gives them the right to cure, meaning they're most likely going to have to come down on the purchase price in order for the deal to close. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that's always the case. Maybe your buyer has some cash on hand and can make up part of the difference. But this is just indicating if the seller has the right to cure, the seller may satisfy the contingency by delivering a notice to the buyer, adjusting the purchase price to the value shown on the appraisal report within blank days after delivery. I've kept 5 days. I'll just put 5 days here. So this, remember in the home inspection, I said, please send the home inspection report to the listing agent. Don't send a home inspection report to the lender. Well, if your house gets appraised and say the appraised value, the appraiser says the home is worth $500,000. If the appraised value comes in higher than what you're purchasing the house for, you don't need to send the appraisal report to the listing agent. All you have to do is say, value is good. We're moving forward into loan commitment. The only time you would ever show the listing agent and the seller the appraisal report is if the appraised value comes in at a lower amount than what you are offering. So again, seller can satisfy by delivering notice to the buyer, adjusting the purchase price to the value shown on the report within 5 days. Offer is null and void if the buyer makes timely delivery of the notice objecting to the appraised value and the written appraisal report, and the seller either doesn't have the right to cure, or the seller has the right to cure and they just choose not to. So make sure you just read some of that language. The bottom sections here on page, whatever page we are on, this is if the buyer had to sell their house before they purchased a new house. It's called a home sale contingency. We're not including that today. A bump clause usually accompanies a home sale contingency. We're not going to cover that one today. We are not writing as a secondary offer. So a secondary offer would be where a seller has already accepted an offer and maybe they're getting backup offers ready to go to review if they feel the first offer that they accepted is going south. Excuse me. But we're writing for primary. Our closing proration. So this is how are we going to figure out taxes, home assessment, or special assessments, you know, etc. The majority of times you check box line 366, meaning we're going to look at what the taxes were from the previous year, and then we'll prorate them accordingly. But there are other options that you might be filling out if there was a new construction or if the property was originally land and it's taxed as land, but now there is a home on it, so the taxes might be different. So there's a bunch of different ways that you could actually prorate things, but for our purposes today, we're just going to prorate everything on a daily basis based on 2023 taxes. This section covers title and what title is and who provides title and what is acceptable title for closing. So make sure that you take a look at that. If you ever have any title questions, our partners at Focus are a great resource. We just had them in for productivity coaching in North Shore last week. They were super helpful and provided a lot of documentation. So if you ever have questions about title, by all means, call them. Definitions here, don't need to do anything with that. Maintenance, so this just indicates that the seller has to keep the property in the same condition that the buyer saw it in at the time of the offer. If there was damage between the offer getting accepted and closing, say the water heater broke. This section here indicates that the seller just has to notify the buyer in writing what happened. The seller is responsible for fixing it before closing. If there was some type of damage that exceeded 5% of the purchase price, I always say the example is, what if a tree fell through the roof during a storm? The seller has to notify the buyer in writing what happened, and the buyer does have the opportunity, if the damage exceeds 5% of the purchase price, the buyer could actually choose to get out of the offer if they wanted to. Pre-closing walkthrough, this just indicates the buyer has the opportunity within 3 days prior to close to have a walkthrough to make sure that the home is in the condition that the buyer saw it in. If any repairs were done as a result of the home inspection contingency, this is your time to take a look to make sure everything is in tip-top shape. And there's just a bunch of other stuff here that I'm just speeding through. I'm not even going to cover because I want to get to the other documents, but please make sure that you read this offer over and over again, because there's so much information. And again, every answer to any question you have is already in the document. If we were writing our offer with our commission to be included in the offer, we'd be checking the box here and putting an amount, but we have signed a compensation agreement ahead of time, so we don't need to worry about that. And then in the blank lines, the additional provisions, our zip form should already include this language for you. So if any contingency deadline falls on a Saturday, Sunday, federal, state holiday, the deadline gets extended to the next business day. But the only time that doesn't happen is binding acceptance. So binding acceptance can happen 365 days a year. It doesn't matter what day of the week. And then I mentioned when we were in the home inspection section that I added some language to the end of the offer about how a seller could cure any type of repairs. And this language here, seller shall have the right to cure in a good and workmanlike manner using professional experts, etc. I found this language here by using this clause library over on the right. So we've got a bunch of pre-written clauses or language that has been approved by our attorney. So there's a bunch of things here. I would highly suggest you take a look at some of these because you might want to use them in your offer. But for this one, I used the right to cure clause. I literally just took this information, copied it, and put it in the document. Lastly, how are these documents going to be delivered? We might hand them in person. So I would hand it to Peter, the listing agent, or Peter could hand it to me, the buyer's agent, or you might use email. So here is the email address for the seller, which is the listing agent, and the email address for the buyer is you. The addenda that we're including are Addendum A and GMAR Addendum AC. I'll show you that in a second. Make sure you write your name and your firm in terms of who actually drafted the offer. A lot of people forget to put that. And that's pretty much it. That's your offer. I'm going to quickly run through Addendum A. So this addendum is used for, if there's additional tests that want to be done, like asbestos tests or mold tests, if there's a well or a private sanitary system on the property and you want to get those tested. This is the document that you would use for that. There's various sections, but today for our purposes, the only box we're checking on this document is line 203, that we're including a lead-based paint addendum with our offer. So because the house was built before 1978, there was a lead-based paint addendum. We have to make sure that we include that within our offer. So that's really the only box that I'm checking here. And then at the bottom of this offer, or at the bottom of the document, we have to fill in all the information for us, the buyer's agent. And then all the information here on the right is for the listing agent. And you can get all of this information directly from MLS. It's at the very bottom. So here's the team listing information, the listing office license number, listing agent's license number, etc. And then I'm going to get to our final addendum, Addendum AC. So there's 3 sections to this addendum. There is the inspection contingency. So if you had a home inspection done and maybe your buyers are willing to take on a specific dollar amount in repairs themselves, before asking the seller to take on the rest, that's the section that we would fill in, but we're not doing that today. If maybe your buyers had some cash on hand that they could use to cover any type of gap in an appraisal, this is where you would check the box and you would talk about how much money your buyer might be willing to cover, but we're not doing that today. What we're using this document for is the escalation clause. So this escalation clause is a contingency that can help a buyer automatically increase the price of their offer if they know that they are in competition. So I'm just going to read this section right here. So if the seller accepts this offer and gets 1 or more additional bona fide offers to purchase the property, no later than blank, I've put here the date that we are asking for binding acceptance. So say seller gets our offer and the seller gets 2 other offers between now and the end of the day tomorrow, November 6th. That result in net proceeds of the sale. So really the seller's take home proceeds payable to the seller equal to or greater than the net proceeds of the sale payable to the seller under this offer. So meaning we're offering $484,900. Say an offer comes in for $486. The purchase price of this offer shall automatically increase to an amount which generates net proceeds of the sale to the seller blank in excess of the other offer. So say again, we offered $484,900. The seller got another offer that offered $486,000. The seller could use this escalation clause to trigger our offer to increase by a specific amount of money. And I put here $3,500. So we would increase our purchase price by $3,500. Now, how many times we want to do that depends on your buyer. Maybe they only want to up their purchase price 1 time by $3,500. So you check that box. Maybe they're okay continuing. What if this goes back and forth? Like this one says 486. Well, now we're at 488.5. And maybe somebody, the other one also had an escalation clause and one goes back and forth and back and forth. If your buyers are able to, it makes your offer more competitive if you can keep on increasing your offer by the amount stated in line 40 more than once. But what's important to note is your buyer can also say, I don't want to exceed blank amount of money. I don't care, I'm done. At $510,000, I'm done. I'm out. So the escalation clause can be very helpful for a buyer because it might prevent them from overpaying if they're in competition. What is maybe a negative for the escalation clause from a seller's perspective is, well, it's actually a bonus for the seller. The seller's kind of seeing your cards, like they're saying, well, they originally offered me $484,900, but really they're willing to go up to $510,000. So it's just something to keep in mind, but this can be a contingency within a buyer's offer that can certainly help a buyer win out over others, especially if offer prices are very similar and maybe the other offer doesn't have an escalation clause. So if your seller does in fact get a few offers and they do need to, and they do decide to initiate the escalation clause and say our buyer won, the seller has to, within blank days, I put 1 day. So after the seller has accepted our offer and initiated the escalation clause, the seller has to send that other offer directly to the buyer. So the buyer has proof that the seller did in fact receive an offer that was originally higher than ours, right? We need to have proof. But what happens here is the agents are taken out of this. The seller has to send that offer directly to the buyer. And that's why we're putting the buyer's email address here. This is really not Bobby Porter's real email address, but we'll just pretend that it's Bobby Loves MKE. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes, but this gets submitted with the original offer.
Correct.
So the listing agent, he's not allowed to say anything like, I think we could do better, or sway, why wouldn't your buddy put in an offer on this house then for X amount of money, just a bogus offer, knowing that it would be escalated?
A
So
listing
that
agent
could
could
be,
ask. Yeah, a listing agent could ask. You could also, a seller could also counter. If anyone was on contract training yesterday, Joan talked about multiple counter offers. Like, what if, a seller receives 3 offers? Maybe the offer price on the 3 offers is different, but maybe one of them includes an escalation clause. Rather than dealing with an escalation clause, a seller might come back with a multiple counteroffer of a different offer price to everybody, just to cut to the chase. Some buyers agents don't like to use this. Some listing agents don't like getting offers that have this in it because it's more work, and it can get really confusing if there are multiple offers that have escalation clauses, because it's like a domino effect. One influences the other, and this one influences that one, and that one. Yeah, it's fun. But this would be included in your original offer. And if the seller does in fact initiate the escalation clause and it raises the price of your offer. So say the seller comes back to us and says, Bobby, we initiated the escalation clause. We did it a couple of times, but your purchase price is $500,000. The seller has to send to Bobby a copy of the other offer that triggered the escalation clause for proof within 1 day that we selected here. And then both parties must sign an amendment indicating there was a change in the purchase price once the offer was accepted. Makes sense? We have a recent contract training from a couple weeks ago is actually also up on YouTube that talks specifically about addendum AC and goes into a little bit more depth about these 3 sections. So those are the 3 documents that I drafted for this offer. In your offer packet, you'd also be including a signed copy of the condition report. And you would also need to be providing a signed copy of addendum S indicating whether or not your buyer would be waiving a lead paint inspection or having one. Usually those get waived. But that would make up the offer packet along with the buyer's pre-approval letter. So if anybody wants practice and wants me to take a look at their offer, I would be happy to take a look. Send me your offer in one PDF and put together a cover letter. So within your email, in the body of your email, summarize some highlights about the offer and send it to me by tomorrow at 11 and I'll take a look at it. I hope everybody found this interesting. And if anyone has questions, let me know.
Awesome. Thank you.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Tulu, bye-bye.
Bye.